Welcome back to another story on Infidelity Tales Lab. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you watching from? Now, let's dive into today's story. Chapter 1. The Fool's Purchase. Robert Bobby Hayes had calloused hands that told the story of 30 years in construction, but those same hands shook slightly as he signed the deed to the abandoned Sunset gas station. At 45, with graying temples and crow's feet earned from squinting at blueprints under harsh sight lights, Bobby knew this was either his salvation or his final mistake. The gas station had been shuttered since 1987, its red and white paint peeling like sunburned skin. Weeds pushed through cracks in the concrete where pumps once stood, and the convenience store's windows were boarded up with plywood that had weathered to the color of old bone. But Bobby saw potential where others saw decay. "You're buying what?" Linda Hayes had screeched when he first mentioned it 3 weeks ago. His wife of 23 years stood in their kitchen, her perfectly manicured nails, paid for with money they didn't have, drumming against the granite countertop Trevor Mills had installed at cost. Trevor, their friend and Linda's frequent lunch companion. Bobby should have paid more attention to those lunches. Linda was 42, but fought aging like it was a personal enemy. Blonde highlights covered the gray, and her yoga classes kept her figure trim. She worked as a real estate agent, though her sales had been declining as the market shifted. A gas station, Bobby? We're already behind on the mortgage. It's an investment, Bobby had insisted, though doubt gnawed at him even then. The interstate expansion is coming through in 2 years. This location will be prime real estate. That conversation felt like a lifetime ago as Bobby pocketed the keys. The seller, an elderly man named Harold Kemper, had been eager to get rid of the property. Too eager, perhaps. But Bobby had scraped together every dollar of their savings, $47,000 for the down payment, securing a seller finance deal that Harold seemed almost desperate to close. The drive home took Bobby through downtown Millbrook, a town of 8,000 nestled in the rolling hills of central Pennsylvania. Main Street still held traces of its former prosperity, a classic movie theater, a diner with red vinyl booths, and Mills Construction, the company that had built half the new developments around town. Trevor Mills had inherited the business from his father and expanded it aggressively, always wearing expensive suits and driving luxury trucks that gleamed under the streetlights. Bobby's own truck, a 10-year-old Ford with rust spots and a temperamental transmission, felt shabby in comparison as he pulled into his driveway. The colonial house, modest but well-maintained, sat on a street lined with mature maples. It was the kind of neighborhood where people knew each other's business, which made what happened next all the more humiliating. Derek was waiting in the living room when Bobby walked in, still wearing the khakis and button-down from his new job at the bank. At 22, Bobby's son had inherited Linda's sharp features and her talent for making Bobby feel small. Fresh out of Penn State with a business degree, Derek had opinions about everything and the confidence to share them. "Dad, please tell me Mom is exaggerating about this gas station thing," Derek said without preamble. Bobby set his keys on the end table, noting how Derek didn't even look up from his phone. "It's a sound investment, son. Location is everything in real estate." Location. Derek finally lifted his head, his expression a mixture of disbelief and embarrassment. "It's a dump on the edge of town. You emptied our savings for a building that's been condemned for 40 years. 37 years, Bobby corrected, immediately hating how defensive he sounded. "Jesus, Dad." Derek stood and began pacing, a habit he'd picked up from Linda. "Do you know what people are saying? Trevor Mills told half the town you've lost your mind." He said, "I don't care what Trevor Mills said." The sharpness in Bobby's voice surprised them both. Derek stopped pacing. "Maybe you should care. He knows the construction business better than anyone. He's successful, Dad. When's the last time you could say that about yourself?" The words hit Bobby like a punch to the solar plexus. When had his own son started looking at him with such disdain? When had Trevor Mills become the standard by which Bobby was measured? Before Bobby could respond, Linda's car pulled into the driveway, the BMW SUV that had seemed like a good idea when she was selling 3 houses a month. She walked through the front door, carrying shopping bags from stores they couldn't afford, her face already arranged in the expression Bobby had come to dread. "Well," she demanded, Did you come to your senses, or did you actually go through with this insanity? Bobby pulled the deed from his jacket pocket. It's done. The silence that followed was pregnant with 23 years of accumulated resentment. Linda's face went through several emotions: shock, anger, and finally, a cold calculation that Bobby had never seen before. "You're a fool," Derek said, his voice flat. "A complete fool." Linda dropped her shopping bags. $47,000, Bobby. That was everything. Every penny we had saved for Derek's future, for our retirement, for... She stopped, pressing her fingers to her temples. "You're a hopeless failure." The words hung in the air like smoke from a house fire. Bobby looked at his wife, really looked at her, and saw a stranger. When had she started looking at him like he was something she'd stepped in? When had Derek learned to speak to him with such contempt? "I'm going to Rebecca's," Linda said, referring to her sister. "I need to think about our future, about Derek's future, about whether we even have one." She gathered her bags and headed for the stairs, then stopped. "Trevor offered to help with Derek's student loans, you know. At least someone in this town has their priorities straight." Bobby stood alone in his living room as his family dispersed like smoke. The deed to the Sunset gas station felt heavy in his pocket, a paper anchor dragging him down. But something else stirred in his chest, something that had been dormant for too long. He'd been called a fool before. By supervisors who promoted less qualified men, by contractors who underbid his estimates, by a world that seemed determined to grind down men like him. But this time felt different. This time, the people calling him a fool were supposed to love him. Bobby walked to the window and looked out at the street where he'd raised his son, where he'd built what he thought was a life worth living. Trevor Mills drove past in his gleaming black F-150, heading toward the part of town where the successful people lived. Tomorrow, Bobby would start cleaning out his gas station. Tonight, he would remember what it felt like to be called a failure by the two people whose opinions mattered most. And somewhere in the darkness behind his ribs, something cold and patient began to take shape. Chapter 2. The Discovery. The Sunset gas station looked even more desolate in the gray morning light. Bobby arrived at sunrise with a thermos of coffee and a toolbox, determined to assess exactly what his $47,000 had bought him. The October air was crisp, carrying the smell of dying leaves and the distant aroma of bacon from Murphy's Diner down the road. Harold Kemper had left behind a ring of keys that looked like they belonged in a medieval dungeon. Bobby worked his way through them systematically, finding that most of the locks had seized decades ago. The front door to the convenience store finally yielded to the seventh key, opening with a groan that seemed to echo from another era. Inside, Tom had stopped in 1987. Faded advertisements for Coca-Cola and Marlboro cigarettes still clung to the walls, and a layer of dust covered everything like a burial shroud. The shelves were empty but intact, and the old cash register sat silent behind a counter marked with coffee rings and cigarette burns. Surprisingly, most of the fixtures were still functional. The lights worked, and the plumbing held pressure when Bobby tested it. But it was the smell that caught his attention. Beneath the mustiness and decay was something else: machine oil and metal, as if industrial equipment had been stored here long after the station closed. The scent was strongest toward the back of the store, behind a door marked "Employees Only." The storage room was larger than expected, running almost the full width of the building. More intriguingly, it had been recently used. While the front of the station had collected decades of dust, this room showed signs of regular activity until perhaps 5 years ago. Oil stains on the concrete floor formed patterns that suggested heavy machinery had been moved in and out repeatedly. Bobby's construction background kicked in as he examined the room more carefully. The electrical panel had been upgraded sometime in the late 1990s, professional work that someone had paid good money for. Ventilation fans had been installed in the ceiling, their housings still clean despite the shutdown. This wasn't a storage room. It was a workshop. Along the rear wall, Bobby found something that made his blood run cold. A section of the cinder block wall had been painted over recently, but not carefully. Beneath the fresh paint, he could make out older markings, spray-painted numbers, and letters that looked like some kind of inventory system. But it was what he found hidden behind a loose panel in the wall that changed everything. The cavity contained a metal filing box, wrapped in plastic and tucked deep into the wall space. Bobby's hands trembled as he pulled it free and set it on the dusty floor. Inside were papers, lots of them, meticulously organized and protected. Bills of lading, shipping manifests, and ledgers dating back to 1995, all bearing the header Mills Construction, Specialized Transport Division. Bobby's breath caught as he read through the documents. Trevor Mills's father, Raymond Mills, had used this location as a transfer point for construction materials. But these weren't ordinary materials. The manifests listed quantities of asbestos tiles, lead-based paints, and other hazardous substances that were being quietly disposed of rather than properly remediated. Thousands of tons over a 12-year period, ending in 2007, coincidentally, the year Raymond Mills died and Trevor took over the company. But the real revelation was in the photographs. Polaroids showing trucks dumping material in what Bobby recognized as Miller's Pond, the same pond that supplied water to 3 residential developments built by Mills Construction in the early 2000s. The same developments where an unusual cluster of cancer cases had emerged in recent years, prompting ongoing lawsuits that Trevor had publicly blamed on faulty municipal water treatment. Bobby sat back on his heels, mind racing. Trevor hadn't just inherited a construction company. He'd inherited a secret that could destroy him. And Harold Kemper, who'd been Raymond Mills's partner in the operation according to these documents, had just sold Bobby the evidence for less than $50,000. The final piece of the puzzle was a handwritten note paperclipped to the last photograph. Harold, everything stays buried as long as the money keeps coming. RM. Below it, in different handwriting. Trevor, the old man's dead, but the deal stands. Double the monthly payment or everything goes public. HK. Bobby understood now why Harold had been so eager to sell, why he'd taken such a low price. Trevor had been paying him hush money for years, but something had changed. Maybe Trevor had stopped paying, or maybe Harold had gotten sick of being dependent on the Mills family's generosity. Either way, Bobby now held the keys to Trevor Mills's kingdom. His phone buzzed with a text from Linda, staying at Rebecca's indefinitely. Derek is right. You've lost your mind. Don't contact me until you're ready to act like an adult. Bobby stared at the message, then at the documents spread around him. An adult. Linda wanted him to act like an adult. He thought about Trevor Mills, who'd built his empire on poison and lies, who'd been sleeping with Bobby's wife while paying blackmail money to keep his secrets buried. He thought about Derek, so quick to worship successful men without questioning how they'd achieve their success. Bobby carefully repacked the documents and sealed the box. As he locked up the gas station and drove home, his mind was already working through possibilities. He'd spent his life building things, houses, bridges, foundations meant to last. But there was another kind of construction, the kind that involved carefully placing pressures and forces until something collapsed under its own weight. Trevor Mills had spent years constructing a lie. It was time someone showed him how easily things could come tumbling down. The house was empty when Bobby arrived, Linda's absence hanging in the air like a held breath. He put the filing box in his basement workshop, hidden behind his tool bench where no one would think to look. Then he opened a beer and sat in his kitchen, staring out at the street where his neighbors were living their normal lives. His phone rang. Trevor Mills. Bobby, hey, heard about your big purchase yesterday. Trevor's voice carried that particular tone successful men used when talking to failures. Condescending sympathy wrapped in false concern. Listen, I wanted to reach out. If you need help getting that property cleaned up, I could probably send a crew over. Professional courtesy, you know? Bobby smiled, a cold expression that would have surprised his family. That's generous of you, Trevor, but I think I can handle it myself. You sure? That place has been abandoned for a long time. No telling what kind of environmental issues you might run into. Could be expensive to remediate properly. I'll keep that in mind, Bobby said. Anything specific I should be worried about? The pause was brief, but telling. No, nothing specific. Just, old buildings can be full of surprises. Yes, Bobby agreed. They certainly can. After hanging up, Bobby poured himself another beer and began planning. He had all the time in the world now. Linda was gone. Derek had made his feelings clear, and the gas station sat waiting like a loaded gun. The only question was how to pull the trigger for maximum effect. Trevor Mills had no idea that his carefully constructed world was about to come crashing down. And Bobby Hayes, the fool, the failure, the man who couldn't do anything right, was going to be the one holding the hammer. Chapter 3. Pieces in Motion. 3 days after Linda left, Bobby received divorce papers. She'd had them drawn up faster than any real estate closing he'd ever seen, which told him she'd been planning this long before his gas station purchase. The papers cited irreconcilable differences and requested half of all marital assets, including Bobby's new property. Bobby sat in his empty kitchen, studying the legal documents while rain drummed against the windows. Linda wanted the house, half his pension, and alimony payments that would leave him with barely enough to survive. Her lawyer was Mitchell Brennan, the most expensive divorce attorney in the county, far beyond what Linda could afford on her real estate commissions. Someone was backing her play. Bobby's phone buzzed with a text from Derek. "Mom told me about the divorce. Maybe now you'll stop being selfish and think about what's best for everyone." His own son, 22 years old and already an expert on marriage, relationships, and what constituted selfishness. The rain intensified, matching Bobby's mood as he drove to the gas station. He'd spent the last 3 days researching everything he could about the Mills family and their business empire. Trevor's father, Raymond, had started with a small concrete company in the 1970s and built it into the dominant construction firm in 3 counties. Trevor had inherited smoothly in 2007, expanding into commercial development and government contracts. But the public record told only part of the story. The documents Bobby had found painted a picture of systematic environmental crime spanning over a decade. Raymond Mills had turned the gas station into a clearinghouse for hazardous materials that should have been properly disposed of. Instead, they'd been dumped in isolated locations around the county, poisoning groundwater and soil that thousands of people now called home. The beauty of the scheme was its simplicity. Mills Construction would bid on remediation jobs, removing asbestos from old schools, lead paint from government buildings, contaminated soil from industrial sites. They'd get paid to clean up the mess. Then instead of paying the enormous fees for proper disposal, they'd dump everything in remote locations and pocket the difference. The Sunset gas station had been their logistics hub, far enough from town to avoid notice, but close enough to serve multiple dumping sites. Bobby unlocked the storage room and spread out a county map he'd purchased that morning. Using the GPS coordinates from the shipping manifests, he marked every location mentioned in the documents. 17 sites in total, scattered across 3 counties. Miller's Pond was just one of many. The pattern was clear. Raymond Mills had been brilliant in his selection of dump sites, abandoned quarries, remote wetlands, and used corners of state forest land. Places where discovery was unlikely for decades, if ever. But the cancer clusters in the Meadowbrook, Sunset Hills, and Pine Ridge developments all traced back to groundwater contaminated by these dumps. Trevor Mills knew. The documents made that clear. After his father's death, he'd continued paying Harold Kemper to keep quiet about the operation. But Trevor had made one crucial mistake. He'd stopped cleaning up his father's messes and started creating new ones. A separate folder contained records from 2008 onwards, documenting continued illegal dumping by Trevor's crews. The old man might have been a criminal, but at least he'd been smart about it. Trevor was sloppy, arrogant, and greedy. He'd kept using some of the same dump sites while expanding into new territory, including a wetland preserve that bordered the elementary school. Bobby's phone rang, interrupting his research. Linda's name appeared on the screen. "Bobby, we need to talk." Her voice was different, nervous where it had been cold, almost pleading where it had been demanding. Bobby hadn't heard her sound uncertain in years. "About what, Linda?" "About us. About this whole situation." She paused, and Bobby could hear voices in the background. "Maybe I was too hasty with the divorce papers. Maybe we can work something out." "Where are you?" Another pause. "I'm at Trevor's office. He offered to mediate, help us find a solution that works for everyone." Bobby smiled, that cold expression becoming more familiar each day. "I'll be right there." Mills Construction occupied a modern glass building on the edge of town's business district. Bobby had driven past it countless times, watching it grow from a small office into a sprawling complex that housed 60 employees and millions of dollars in equipment. Trevor's personal office was on the third floor, with floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a commanding view of the town he'd helped shape. Linda was waiting in the reception area, looking smaller than Bobby remembered. She wore a navy business suit and had her hair pulled back severely, as if she were attending a funeral. She wouldn't meet his eyes when he approached. "Bobby." Trevor emerged from his office wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Bobby made in a month. "Thanks for coming. I thought it might help if we could all sit down and talk through this situation like adults." The conference room was all glass and chrome, designed to intimidate. Trevor took the head of the table while Linda sat to his right, leaving Bobby to take the chair across from them. The symbolism wasn't lost on any of them. "Look, Bobby," Trevor began, his voice carrying the same false sympathy from their phone call. "Linda's been going through a rough time. The stress of your financial situation has been hard on her, on your whole family." Bobby nodded, saying nothing. "The thing is," Trevor continued, "I've been thinking about ways to help. Your gas station, for instance. I might be interested in purchasing it from you. Save you the headache of trying to develop it yourself." "At what price?" "Well, given the condition of the property, the environmental risks, the cost of bringing it up to code." Trevor shrugged. "I could offer you $30,000. That would cover most of what you paid, help you move on with your life." Bobby looked at Linda, who was studying her hands. "Is that what you want? For me to sell the station?" "I want us to be practical," Linda said quietly. "Trevor's trying to help us, Bobby. He's offering you a way out." "A way out," Bobby repeated. "And what happens after I sell? Do we reconcile? Work on our marriage?" Linda finally looked up, and Bobby saw something in her eyes he'd never seen before, guilt mixed with fear. "We could try. If you're willing to make some changes, be more responsible." Bobby stood, walked to the window, and looked down at the parking lot where Trevor's black truck gleamed beside Linda's BMW. "You know, Trevor, I've been learning a lot about responsibility lately. About the responsibilities we have to our community, our environment, our families." "That's great, Bobby. Really great. For instance," Bobby continued, "I learned that when you're handling hazardous materials, you have a responsibility to dispose of them properly. Even if it's expensive. Even if cutting corners would save you millions of dollars." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Trevor's smile flickered, and Linda looked confused. "I'm not sure what you're getting at," Trevor said carefully. Bobby turned back to the table. "I'm getting at the fact that your offer is inadequate. Grossly inadequate, given what I've discovered about the property's history." Trevor's face had gone pale beneath his tan. "What kind of history?" "The kind that involves trucks, late-night deliveries, and creative approaches to waste disposal." Bobby smiled. "The kind that might interest the EPA, the State Environmental Agency, and several district attorneys." Linda looked between them, finally sensing the undercurrent. "Bobby, what are you talking about?" "I'm talking about your friend Trevor's family business. The part they don't advertise on their website." Trevor stood abruptly. "I think this meeting is over." "No," Bobby said, his voice carrying an authority that surprised everyone in the room, including himself. "This meeting is just getting started. Sit down, Trevor." Something in Bobby's tone made Trevor hesitate. For the first time in years, Bobby Hayes was the most dangerous man in the room, and everyone could feel it. "Linda," Bobby said, not taking his eyes off Trevor, "you wanted me to act like an adult. You wanted me to be responsible. Well, congratulations. You're about to see exactly what that looks like." Chapter 4. The Education of Linda Hayes. Linda Hayes had married Bobby, thinking she understood exactly what kind of man he was: steady, reliable, predictable to the point of boredom. In 23 years of marriage, she'd never seen him lose his temper, never seen him scheme or manipulate, never seen him be anything other than a straightforward construction worker who'd swept her off her feet in college. The man sitting across from her in Trevor's conference room was someone else entirely. "Bobby, you're scaring me," Linda said, and meant it. There was something in her husband's eyes she'd never seen before, a cold calculation that made her stomach clench. Good, Bobby replied. You should be scared. Both of you should be. Trevor had sat back down, but perched on the edge of his chair like he was ready to run. Bobby, I don't know what you think you found, but I found your father's filing cabinet. Bobby's voice was conversational, almost friendly, hidden in the back wall of my gas station. Amazing what people leave behind when they think their secrets are safe. The blood drained from Trevor's face so quickly Linda thought he might faint. She looked between the two men, understanding finally that this wasn't about property values or divorce settlements. This was about something much bigger. What filing cabinet? She asked. Bobby smiled at her. The same smile he'd given her when she'd walked down the aisle 23 years ago, except now it felt like a blade pressed against her throat. Your boyfriend's father was a criminal, Linda, and your boyfriend has been continuing the family tradition. He's not my. Linda stopped, realizing that denial was pointless now. Of course he is. Bobby's tone was matter of fact. Do you think I'm stupid? Do you think I haven't noticed the lunch dates, the late-night phone calls, the way you light up when his name comes up in conversation? Linda felt tears building, but refused to let them fall. Not here. Not in front of Trevor, who was staring at Bobby like he was watching a time bomb countdown. The interesting thing, Bobby continued, is how this all fits together. Trevor needed someone with access to property records, someone who could identify homes built on contaminated land before the residents figured it out. Someone who could help his family's victims sell their houses quickly, quietly, before the cancer clusters became front-page news. Linda's stomach dropped. Bobby, I never... Meadowbrook Development, Bobby said. 16 houses sold in the last 2 years, all through your agency. Every one of them built over land contaminated by Mills construction. What was your commission on those sales, Linda? 30,000? 40? She couldn't speak. The numbers were dancing in her head. The unexpected sales, the grateful sellers who'd been so eager to move, the bonuses Trevor had suggested she deserved for her hard work. You knew, she whispered, looking at Trevor. You knew those families were getting sick, and you used me to... I protected you, Trevor said sharply. I made sure you made money while helping people get out of bad situations. That's not a crime. Fraud is a crime, Bobby said. Conspiracy is a crime. And continuing your father's illegal dumping operation, well, that's about 15 different crimes. Trevor stood again, this time with more conviction. You don't know what you're talking about. And even if you did, nobody would believe a washed-up construction worker with a grudge. Bobby pulled out his phone and tapped the screen. Trevor's voice filled the room. That place has been abandoned for a long time. No telling what kind of environmental issues you might run into. Could be expensive to remediate properly. That was from our phone call 3 days ago, Bobby explained. Right after I told you I'd bought the gas station. You were already trying to warn me off the property. Why would you do that unless you knew there was something to find? Trevor lunged across the table, grabbing for Bobby's phone, but Bobby was ready. Years of construction work had kept him strong, and Trevor's desk job had made him soft. Bobby caught Trevor's wrist and twisted, sending him sprawling back into his chair. Assault, Bobby said mildly, in front of witness. I should probably add that to my collection of evidence. Linda watched in horror as her carefully constructed life crumbled around her. The successful businessman she'd been sleeping with was a criminal. The husband she dismissed as a failure was systematically destroying both of them. The reality show moment she'd been living. The powerful man, the expensive lunches, the fantasy of a different life, was revealed as exactly that, a fantasy. What do you want? Trevor asked, cradling his wrist. I want you to understand something, Bobby said. For 23 years, I've watched my wife lose respect for me because I wasn't successful enough. I've watched my son treat me like I was an embarrassment because I couldn't afford the things other fathers could provide. I've watched this town treat me like I was invisible while they celebrated people like you. Bobby stood and walked to the window again. But the thing about being invisible is that you see things other people miss. You notice patterns, like how the cancer rates spiked in developments built by Mills construction, like how certain real estate agents always seem to know when families were ready to sell, like how the most successful businessman in town got nervous when someone bought a worthless piece of property. He turned back to face them. I want you both to know that your secrets aren't secrets anymore. I want you to know that the evidence is secured in multiple locations, with instructions for its release if anything happens to me. Bobby, Linda said, finding her voice. What are you going to do? Bobby looked at his wife, really looked at her, taking in the expensive clothes, the perfect makeup, the guilt and fear in her eyes. I'm going to give you an education, Linda. Both of you. I'm going to teach you what it feels like to lose everything that matters to you. Trevor was reaching for his phone, probably to call his lawyer, but Bobby shook his head. I wouldn't do that just yet. See, there's something else I found in that filing cabinet. Something about a certain state senator who's been very helpful to Mills Construction over the years. Something about campaign contributions and environmental permits that got approved without proper review. Trevor's hand froze over his phone. Senator Crawford has been very good to you, hasn't he? Steering state contracts your way, making sure the environmental inspectors look the other way. It would be such a shame if his constituents learned about your special relationship. Bobby headed for the door, then paused. Linda, you have until tomorrow morning to decide whether you want to be known as the woman who helped poison her neighbor's children or the woman who helped expose the truth. Choose carefully. As he left Mills Construction for what he suspected would be the last time, Bobby felt something he hadn't experienced in years, the satisfaction of being the smartest person in the room. Trevor Mills had built his empire on his father's foundation of lies and crime. Linda had sold her integrity for a few nice dinners and the fantasy of being important. Now, they would both learn what Bobby Hayes could build when he put his mind to it. The rain had stopped, and sunlight was breaking through the clouds as Bobby drove home to his empty house. Tomorrow, he would begin construction on something new, not a building or a bridge, but a reckoning that would reshape the landscape of their small town forever. Chapter 5. The Senator's Dilemma. Senator Patricia Crawford had built her political career on environmental protection and government transparency, which made her current situation particularly ironic. She sat in her state capitol office, reading the documents Bobby Hayes had delivered by courier that morning, watching her future collapse one page at a time. The evidence was devastating. Campaign contributions disguised as consulting fees. Environmental impact studies that had been written before the actual studies were conducted. Permits approved for projects that should never have seen daylight. All of it meticulously documented by Raymond Mills, who apparently had understood the value of insurance policies. Her secretary buzzed the intercom. Senator, there's a Robert Hayes online too. He says it's urgent. Patricia picked up the phone with hands that trembled slightly. Mr. Hayes. Senator Crawford. I trust you received my package. I did. Patricia's voice was carefully controlled, a skill learned through 20 years in politics. I assume you have demands. I have a proposal, Bobby corrected. One that could benefit both of us. Patricia looked out her office window at the Capitol grounds, where protesters were already gathering for the afternoon session on the new Environmental Protection Bill. Her bill. The irony was suffocating. I'm listening. I want Trevor Mills destroyed, Bobby said simply. Completely, professionally, personally. In return, I'm prepared to be very selective about what information becomes public. And if I refuse, then tomorrow's headlines will be very interesting reading. Environmental champion exposed as corporate puppet has a nice ring to it, don't you think? Patricia closed her eyes. She'd spent 2 decades fighting for clean water and air, genuinely believing in the cause that had first motivated her to enter politics. The contributions from Mills Construction had started small, a few $1,000s for her first campaign, back when she was nobody special and needed every dollar. Raymond Mills had presented himself as a reformed industrialist, committed to environmental responsibility. By the time she realized what she'd gotten herself into, she was in too deep to escape. The money had grown larger, the favors more significant, the compromises more damaging to her soul. But she told herself it was all in service of the greater good, that she could accomplish more as a senator, even a compromised one, than as a private citizen with clean hands. What exactly are you proposing? She asked. Simple. Use your influence to ensure that every environmental investigation into Mills Construction gets the attention it deserves. No more buried reports. No more favorable interpretations of regulations. When the EPA starts digging into those dumping sites, I want them to find everything. That's it. That's it. Do your job the way you should have been doing it all along, and the parts of these documents that implicate you stay buried. Patricia felt a strange sense of relief. After years of being trapped between her principles and her political survival, Bobby Hayes was offering her a path to redemption. It would still cost her relationship with Mills Construction, the money that had funded her campaigns, probably her political career in the long run. But for the first time in a decade, she could imagine sleeping soundly. What about Trevor specifically? I can't just target his company without cause. Oh, you'll have cause, Bobby said. Lots of it. I'm about to provide the EPA with evidence of ongoing environmental crimes. Your job is to make sure that evidence gets the investigation it deserves. And if Trevor tries to implicate me, that's the beauty of this arrangement, Senator. If Trevor talks about your relationship, he's admitting that Mills Construction has been bribing public officials for years. That's another federal crime. He can't expose you without destroying himself. After hanging up, Patricia sat quietly in her office, thinking about choices and consequences. She'd compromised her way into this mess, but perhaps she could still find a way to serve the people who'd elected her to protect them. Her phone rang again. Trevor Mills, sounding panicked. Patricia, I need to see you. Now, that maniac Bobby Hayes is trying to blackmail me, and I think he's got information about our business relationship. What kind of information? My father's old files. I thought they were destroyed, but apparently he hid copies. Listen, I need you to make some calls, shut down any investigations before they start. Can you do that? Patricia looked at the documents spread across her desk. Evidence of children poisoned, families destroyed, an environment devastated for profit. I'm afraid I can't help you. Trevor, what do you mean you can't help me? I've given your campaigns over $200,000 in the last 10 years. And that's exactly why I can't help you, Patricia said, then hung up. 20 minutes later, she called a press conference. Chapter 6, The Reckoning Begins. The Millbrook County Courthouse had never seen anything like the crowd that gathered on Tuesday morning. EPA investigators, state environmental officials, FBI agents, reporters from 3 states, and what seemed like half the town's population all converged as Trevor Mills was led up the courthouse steps in handcuffs. Bobby Hayes watched from across the street, leaning against his truck and drinking coffee from a thermos. 3 weeks had passed since his conversation with Senator Crawford, and the machinery of justice had moved with surprising speed once it was finally unleashed. The charges were extensive: 27 counts of illegal dumping, 15 counts of environmental fraud, conspiracy to commit bribery, and racketeering. The investigation had expanded beyond Mills Construction to include 3 other companies in adjacent counties, all connected to the same network of illegal waste disposal that Raymond Mills had pioneered. But the criminal charges were just the beginning. Bobby, he turned to see Linda approaching, looking like she'd aged 5 years in 3 weeks. She'd moved back into their house after Trevor's arrest, sleeping in the guest bedroom and moving through their shared spaces like a ghost. The class action lawyers called this morning, she said. They're going after everyone connected to the sales in those developments. They want to depose me next week. Bobby nodded. The civil suits had been inevitable once the story broke. 300 families whose children had developed cancer, whose property values had collapsed overnight, whose lives had been irrevocably damaged by the Mills family's greed. The lawsuits would drag on for years and bankrupt everyone involved, including Linda. What will you tell them? Linda wrapped her arms around herself against the October wind. The truth. That I didn't know, but I should have. That I was so busy chasing money and status that I didn't ask the right questions. And Trevor. Trevor's lawyer says he might cooperate with prosecutors if they reduce the charges. He's already started talking about people who were supposed to be his friends. She looked at Bobby with something that might have been respect. He's not the man I thought he was. Bobby almost smiled. What kind of man did you think he was? Strong. Successful. Someone who had control of his life. Linda paused. Someone who wasn't you. The words might have hurt once, but Bobby felt nothing. And now I see that you were the strong one. All those years, I thought you were weak because you followed the rules, because you didn't cut corners, because you couldn't provide the things other men could provide. I was wrong. Bobby looked back at the courthouse, where Trevor Mills was disappearing into a system that would grind him up as efficiently as he'd ground up everyone else. Being strong isn't about having power over other people, Linda. It's about having power over yourself. Trevor never understood that. Derek appeared on the courthouse steps, looking uncomfortable in his bank-issued suit. He'd been subpoenaed as well, since his student loans had been co-signed by Trevor Mills personally. Loans that investigators now suspected were another form of bribery, intended to secure Linda's cooperation through her son. "He hates me," Linda said, watching Derek scan the crowd. "He hates the situation. There's a difference. Will you ever forgive me?" Bobby considered the question seriously. 3 weeks ago, he would have said yes without hesitation, so desperate was he to hold onto whatever scraps of his family remained. But the man who'd signed those divorce papers in Trevor's office was gone, replaced by someone harder and more clear-eyed. "I might forgive you eventually," he said, "but I'll never trust you again. And I'll never forget what you chose when the choice mattered." Linda nodded, tears finally coming. "The divorce will go through. The divorce will go through. You can keep the house. I won't need it much longer anyway. Where will you go?" Bobby finished his coffee and screwed the cap back on his thermos. The gas station was already being transformed, bulldozers working to clear the contaminated soil, while EPA investigators cataloged every piece of evidence. When the cleanup was finished, the property would be worth exactly what Bobby had paid for it. Nothing. But it had already given him everything he'd needed. "I haven't decided yet. Somewhere I can start over." "Bobby," Linda's voice was small, uncertain. "Do you think there's any chance we could?" "No," Bobby said gently but firmly. "There isn't." As he walked back to his truck, Bobby thought about the last conversation he'd had with Trevor Mills. It had been 2 days after the arrest, a desperate phone call from the county jail. "This is insane, Bobby. You're destroying innocent people over something my father did 40 years ago. Your father died in 2007, Trevor. The dumping continued until last year. You made that choice. It was just business. Nobody was supposed to get hurt. Tell that to the families in Meadowbrook. Tell that to the Hendersons, whose 8-year-old daughter has leukemia. Tell that to the Kowalskis, who lost their son last month." The line had been quiet for a long moment. "What do you want? Money? I can make this worth your while." "I want you to understand something," Bobby had said. "For 23 years, I thought success meant having money, status, respect. I thought it meant being like you. But success actually means being able to look at yourself in the mirror without flinching. It means building things that last, not tearing them down for profit. You're destroying everything I've worked for." "No, Trevor, I'm just showing people what you actually built." Now, watching the courthouse spectacle from his truck, Bobby felt a satisfaction that had nothing to do with revenge and everything to do with justice. Trevor Mills would spend the next decade in federal prison. Senator Crawford would resign in disgrace, but avoid prosecution in exchange for her cooperation. Linda would lose her real estate license and probably her house. And Bobby Hayes, the fool who'd bought a worthless gas station, would disappear into the kind of anonymity he'd once feared but now welcomed. His phone buzzed with a text from Derek. "Dad, can we talk?" Bobby looked up at the courthouse steps where his son was still standing, looking lost and young despite his business suit and banker's confidence. Maybe there was still something worth saving there. Maybe not. Either way, Bobby Hayes was done building his life around other people's expectations. The gas station had taught him that the most valuable discoveries often came from the most unlikely places, and that sometimes the only way to build something lasting was to first tear down everything false. He started his truck and drove away from the courthouse, leaving the wreckage of Trevor Mills's empire behind him. The road ahead was empty and full of possibilities. Chapter 7. The Price of Truth. 6 months after Trevor Mills's arrest, Millbrook had become a very different town. The cancer cluster had made national news, bringing investigative journalists, environmental activists, and federal prosecutors who turned over every stone in search of the truth. What they found exceeded even Bobby's expectations. The Mills family had been poisoning central Pennsylvania for 3 generations. Raymond's father had started in the 1950s, dumping industrial waste from Pittsburgh area factories in abandoned mines and quarries. Raymond had expanded the operation and systematized it. Trevor had added new wrinkles, falsifying environmental impact studies, bribing inspectors, using his political connections to suppress investigations. The contamination was worse than anyone had imagined. 17 dump sites had become 23, then 31 as investigators followed the paper trail. The groundwater contamination affected 4 counties and over 10,000 residents. The cleanup costs were estimated at $200 million. Bobby sat in Murphy's diner, reading the morning paper and eating breakfast alone, a routine he'd grown to enjoy. The lead story was about the latest class action settlement. Mills Construction's assets had been seized and liquidated, but the money wouldn't go far when divided among so many victims. Mind if I sit? Bobby looked up to see Derek standing beside his booth, looking nervous and older than his 22 years. He'd lost weight since the scandal broke, and there were shadows under his eyes that spoke of sleepless nights. Sure. Derek slid into the opposite seat, ordered coffee from the waitress, and sat quietly for a moment. Bobby didn't push. He'd learned the value of patience. I've been thinking about what you said. Derek finally spoke. About success, about building things that last. And I think I was wrong about you. About a lot of things. Derek's voice was careful, measured. I thought success meant having money, driving nice cars, being able to afford things. I thought Trevor Mills was successful because he had all that. Bobby sipped his coffee and waited. But he didn't build anything, did he? He inherited a company built on poison and lies, and all he did was make it worse. When it all came apart, there was nothing real underneath. What's your point, Derek? Derek met his father's eyes directly. My point is that I was an asshole. I called you a fool for buying that gas station, but you saw something nobody else did. You had the courage to act on it when it would have been easier to walk away. I didn't do it for courage, Bobby said. I did it for revenge. Maybe. But revenge against what? Against being called a failure by people who were actual failures? Against being dismissed by people who'd built their lives on lies. Bobby considered this. Maybe you're right. Derek's coffee arrived, and he wrapped his hands around the mug like he was trying to warm himself. I quit the bank yesterday. This was news. Derek had been so proud of his position at First National, one of the few jobs in town that hadn't been touched by the Mills scandal. Why? Because they offered me a promotion. Assistant manager of the loan department. Turns out they want someone young and clean to help rebuild their reputation after the investigation showed they'd been laundering money from Mills Construction. Bobby raised an eyebrow. That sounds like an opportunity. It sounds like being rewarded for being connected to the right people instead of doing good work. It sounds like the same kind of thinking that got this town into trouble in the first place. Derek leaned forward. I want to do something real, Dad. Something that matters. I've been thinking about engineering, maybe environmental cleanup. There's going to be a lot of work in that field in the coming years. That would mean going back to school. Yeah, I know I don't have any right to ask, but I was wondering, could you help me figure out how to do it right this time? Not the shortcuts, not the easy way. The right way. Bobby looked at his son, really looked at him, and saw something he hadn't seen since Derek was a child. Humility. A willingness to learn. The kind of character that could actually build something lasting. I might be able to help with that. They talked for another hour about schools and careers and the kind of man Derek wanted to become. It wasn't a complete reconciliation. There was too much damage for that, but it was a beginning. When Derek left, Bobby felt something he hadn't experienced in months. Hope for his family. His phone rang. Linda. Bobby, can you come over? There's something I need to show you. 20 minutes later, Bobby stood in the living room of the house where he'd raised his son and buried his marriage. Linda looked better than she had in months. Not happy, exactly, but calmer. More settled. What did you want to show me? Linda handed him a letter from the Pennsylvania Real Estate Commission. Her license had been permanently revoked, as expected. But attached to it was something Bobby hadn't anticipated. A character reference letter from Patricia Crawford, commending Linda for her cooperation with investigators and her efforts to help affected families navigate the legal process. I've been working with the lawyers representing the cancer victims, Linda explained. helping them understand the sales process, identifying which properties were affected. I can't practice real estate anymore, but I can still help people. That's good of you. It's the least I can do. Linda sat on the couch where they'd spent so many evenings watching television, back when they still thought they had a future together. I've been thinking about what you said about choices that matter. I made the wrong choice, Bobby. I chose status over integrity, excitement over loyalty. I chose a fantasy over my real life. Bobby sat across from her in his old recliner. Why are you telling me this? Because I want you to know that I understand now. What I lost, what I threw away. You were never weak, Bobby. You were strong enough to live by your principles even when they cost you things you wanted. I was the weak one. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, two people who'd shared half their lives but would never share the other half. Derek came to see me today, Bobby said eventually. He told me he was going to. What did you think? I think he's learned something valuable. Pain can be a good teacher if you let it. Linda smiled sadly. What about me? Have I learned anything valuable? Bobby considered the question seriously. You've learned that actions have consequences. That's not nothing. Is it enough? It's a start. When Bobby left the house that evening, he felt lighter somehow. Not forgiven. Forgiveness was still beyond him, but understanding something about closure that he hadn't grasped before. Some chapters ended with reconciliation, others with acceptance. Both had their place. His phone buzzed with a text from a number he didn't recognize. Mr. Hayes, this is Sarah Chun from the Washington Post. I'm working on a story about environmental crime in rural communities, and I'd like to interview you about the Mills case. Would you be available to talk? Bobby deleted the message without responding. His part in this story was finished. He lit the fuse and stepped back, watching other people's lives burn down around them. Now it was time to disappear before the attention turned in his direction. He drove to the gas station one last time. The cleanup was nearly complete, the soil hauled away and replaced with clean fill. In a few weeks, someone would pave it over and turn it into something useful, maybe a small shopping center or a medical clinic. Something that served the community instead of poisoning it. The storage room where he'd found the filing cabinet was gone, demolished and buried under tons of clean earth. But the consequences of what he'd found there would ripple through the region for decades to come. Environmental regulations would be tightened. Politicians would be more careful about their corporate relationships. Companies would think twice before cutting corners that cost people their lives. Bobby Hayes had built something after all, not a bridge or a building, but a reckoning that would protect future generations from the kind of predators who nearly destroyed his town. As he drove away from the gas station for the last time, Bobby felt the satisfaction of a job well done. Tomorrow, he would start looking for a new place to live, a new life to build. Somewhere quiet, where the past couldn't find him and the future stretched out like an open road. Chapter 8. New Foundations. 2 years after buying the gas station, Bobby Hayes lived in a small cabin outside Durango, Colorado, where the mountains stretched to the horizon and his nearest neighbor was half a mile away. He'd found work with a local construction company that specialized in sustainable building, solar installations, green roofing, houses designed to last a century instead of a decade. It was honest work with honest people, and Bobby had discovered that anonymity was a gift he'd never properly appreciated. His co-workers knew him as a skilled craftsman with a dry sense of humor and no interest in gossip. They didn't know about Pennsylvania, about Trevor Mills, about the environmental scandal that had made national headlines for 6 months before being replaced by the next crisis. Bobby preferred it that way. His phone rang while he was eating dinner on his porch, watching elk graze in the meadow below. Derek's name appeared on the screen, their weekly call. Hey, Dad. How's Colorado? Quiet. How's school? Derek was in his second semester at Colorado State, studying environmental engineering and living in a studio apartment he could barely afford. He worked nights at a campus coffee shop to pay for textbooks and groceries, a humbling experience for someone who'd once expected success to be handed to him. Brutal, Derek admitted. Organic chemistry is kicking my ass, but I'm getting through it. They talked about classes and work and the weather, the kind of mundane conversation that had become precious to Bobby because it meant his son was building a real life instead of a fake one. Any word from home? Bobby asked. Mom's doing better. She got a job at the county social services office, helping families navigate the victim compensation program. It doesn't pay much, but she says it feels good to help people instead of, Bobby knew. Linda had lost the house eventually, unable to keep up with the mortgage after losing her real estate income. She'd moved into a small apartment and was slowly rebuilding her life from the ground up, one good choice at a time. Trevor Mills died last week, Derek said quietly. This was news Bobby hadn't expected. Ow! Suicide. Hung himself in his cell at the federal prison in Pennsylvania. Left a note saying he couldn't live with what he'd done. Bobby felt nothing. No satisfaction, no regret, just a blank acceptance of information. Trevor Mills had been a weak man who'd inherited strength he hadn't earned and used it to hurt people. When that borrowed strength was taken away, there hadn't been anything left underneath. How do you feel about it? Bobby asked. Sad, I guess. Not for him, exactly, but I don't know. For the waste of it all, he could have been better than he was. Yes, Bobby agreed. He could have been. After they hung up, Bobby sat on his porch as darkness settled over the mountains. 2 years ago, he'd wanted Trevor Mills destroyed, and now the man was dead by his own hand. It should have felt like victory, but instead it felt like completion. The end of a story that had started long before Bobby bought the gas station. His laptop chimed with an email from Patricia Crawford, who'd become an unlikely ally in the aftermath of the scandal. She'd resigned from the Senate, but had found new purpose as an environmental activist, using her political connections to push for stronger regulations and corporate accountability. Bobby, her message read, thought you'd want to know that the EPA has announced new guidelines for hazardous waste disposal, partly based on the evidence you uncovered. They're calling it the Mills Protocol, ironic but effective. The cancer cluster families are finally getting their full settlement payments. Your gas station ended up saving a lot of lives. Bobby closed the laptop and went inside to make tea. Save lives. He'd never thought of it that way. But perhaps Patricia was right. By refusing to look the other way, by insisting that buried crimes stay buried, he'd protected families he'd never meet from poisons they'd never see. The next morning brought a phone call that changed everything. Mr. Hayes? This is Dr. Amanda Torres from the Environmental Protection Agency. I'm calling because we have a situation in Nevada that's very similar to what you uncovered in Pennsylvania. A construction company with a long history of illegal dumping, possible political corruption, communities that are getting sick and don't know why. Bobby listened as Dr. Torres described a familiar pattern. Cancer clusters near new developments, mysterious construction delays, environmental impact studies that seem designed to obscure rather than illuminate. We were hoping you might be willing to consult on the investigation. Your experience with the Mills case would be invaluable. I'm not an investigator, Bobby said. I'm just a construction worker who got lucky. You're a construction worker who knew what to look for and had the courage to act on it. That's exactly what we need. Bobby looked out his kitchen window at the mountains, thinking about the quiet life he'd built for himself. It was a good life, peaceful and honest. But Dr. Torres was right. He had skills now that other people needed. Knowledge about how predators operated, how they hid their crimes, how they could be exposed. I'll need to think about it. Of course. But Mr. Hayes, there are children getting sick in Nevada. Families who don't know why their water tastes funny or why their property values are dropping. They need someone who understands how these cases work. After hanging up, Bobby made coffee and sat on his porch, watching the sun climb over the mountains. He'd spent 2 years running from his past, building walls between himself and the world that had hurt him. But perhaps it was time to tear down those walls and use what he'd learned to help other people. His phone buzzed with a text from Derek. Dad, saw a news story about some environmental problems in Nevada. Made me think of you. Hope you're staying out of trouble. Bobby smiled and typed back. Actually, I'm thinking about getting into some trouble. The good kind. An hour later, he called Dr. Torres back and accepted her offer. 2 weeks later, Bobby Hayes was standing in the desert outside Las Vegas, looking at an abandoned mining operation that bore an uncomfortable resemblance to the sites he'd found in Pennsylvania. The same pattern of trucks arriving at night, the same carefully falsified paperwork, the same political connections that kept investigators at bay. But this time, Bobby wasn't alone. He had the full resources of the EPA behind him, along with state investigators who knew what they were looking for and federal prosecutors who weren't afraid to take on powerful interests. This time, the criminals wouldn't have a 40-year head start. As Bobby walked across the contaminated ground, taking soil samples and photographing evidence, he thought about the strange journey that had brought him here. 2 years ago, he'd been a failed husband and a disappointing father, dismissed by his family and forgotten by his community. Now, he was Bobby Hayes, environmental investigator, the man who'd exposed the Mills conspiracy and was building a new career on the foundation of that success. Not success measured in money or status, but success measured in problems solved and lives protected. His phone rang. "Linda, Bobby, I just saw the news story about Nevada. Are you involved in that?" "I am. Be careful. These people are dangerous." Bobby looked across the desert at the mountains shimmering in the heat. Somewhere out, there were families who didn't know they were being poisoned, children who would develop cancer if no one acted to stop it. "So, am I," he said, and meant it. Chapter 9. The Reckoning Complete. 5 years after purchasing the Sunset gas station, Bobby Hayes had become something he'd never expected to be. Famous. Not Hollywood famous, but infamous enough that environmental lawyers knew his name and corporate executives whispered about him in boardrooms. The man who destroyed Trevor Mills had become the man who specialized in destroying corporate criminals who thought they were untouchable. The Nevada case had led to arrests, convictions, and a $100 million cleanup. That success had led to consulting work in Arizona, then Oregon, then back to Pennsylvania for a case involving pharmaceutical waste. Bobby had developed a reputation for finding evidence that others missed and building cases that prosecutors couldn't lose. He'd also become rich in the process. Not Mills Construction rich, but comfortable enough to choose his cases based on merit rather than money. On this particular October morning, Bobby sat in his Denver office, reviewing files for a case in North Carolina, when his assistant knocked on the door. "There's someone here to see you," Maria said. Says his name is Michael Breslin, and it's about the Mills case. Bobby looked up, curious. The Mills case had been officially closed for 3 years, Trevor dead, and his company liquidated. What could possibly be left to discuss? Michael Breslin was a thin man in his 50s with nervous eyes and the look of someone carrying a burden too heavy for his shoulders. He sat across from Bobby's desk and fumbled with a manila folder that looked like it had been handled too many times. "Mr. Hayes, I don't know if you remember me. I was a foreman for Mills Construction back in the day. Worked there for 15 years before the whole thing collapsed." Bobby remembered the name from the employee list he'd reviewed during the investigation. "What can I do for you, Mr. Breslin?" "It's what I can do for you." Breslin opened the folder and spread out photographs, Polaroids that looked like they'd been taken in the 1990s. "These are from job sites that weren't in Raymond Mills's files. Places we dumped waste that never made it into the official records." Bobby leaned forward, studying the images. More trucks, more illegal dumping, more contaminated sites that had never been investigated or cleaned up. "Why didn't you come forward during the original investigation?" Breslin's hands shook as he gathered the photos. "Because I was part of it. I knew what we were doing was wrong, but I needed the job. I had 3 kids and a wife, and Mills paid better than anyone else in the county. I told myself it wasn't my responsibility, that I was just following orders." "What changed your mind?" "My grandson." Breslin's voice broke slightly. 8 years old, diagnosed with leukemia last month. Lives in one of the developments that Mills built over contaminated land. Land I helped contaminate. Bobby felt the familiar cold anger that had sustained him through 5 years of environmental investigations. Another family destroyed by the Mills legacy. Another child paying the price for adult greed and cowardice. How many sites are we talking about? 12 that I know of personally. Maybe more. Some of them are under schools now, Mr. Hayes. Elementary schools. Bobby studied the photographs more carefully, cross-referencing them with maps in his head. The locations were scattered across 4 counties, most of them in areas that had been rural in the 1990s but were now heavily developed. "Do you have documentation?" "Shipping manifests, disposal records." "Some. Hidden in my garage for 25 years, eating at me like cancer." Breslin met Bobby's eyes. "I know I'm just as guilty as the rest of them. I know coming forward, now it doesn't make up for staying quiet then. But my grandson is dying, and I can't live with the secret anymore. Bobby understood. Guilt was a powerful motivator, especially when it was backed by the possibility of redemption. What do you want from me? I want you to finish what you started. I want every one of these sites investigated and cleaned up. I want the people responsible held accountable, even if one of them is me. Bobby leaned back in his chair, considering. The Mills case had been satisfying, but incomplete. They'd found 17 contaminated sites when the real number was apparently closer to 30. Children were still getting sick from poisons buried decades ago, and the people responsible had escaped justice by dying before their crimes were fully exposed. Mr. Breslin, if I take this on, it's going to get ugly. There will be more arrests, more companies destroyed, more families whose secrets get dragged into the light. Are you prepared for that? Mr. Hayes, my grandson weighs 60 pounds and can't keep food down. His parents are going bankrupt paying for treatments that might not even work. If exposing the truth can prevent other families from going through this, then yes, I'm prepared for anything. Bobby nodded. There's something you should know. If we do this, if we reopen the Mills investigation and expand it to include these new sites, you'll probably be charged as an accessory. The statute of limitations may have run out on some of it, but not all. I know. I've already talked to a lawyer, and he said I'll probably do time. But my grandson is going to do time too, in hospital beds and chemotherapy suites. At least my time will mean something. Bobby gathered the photographs and put them back in the folder. Give me a week to review everything. If the evidence supports what you're telling me, I'll make some calls. After Breslin left, Bobby sat alone in his office, thinking about cycles and consequences. He'd thought the Mills case was finished, but maybe nothing was ever really finished. Maybe justice was like construction. You built it one foundation at a time, one wall at a time, until eventually you had something that could shelter the innocent from the predators. His phone rang. Derek, calling from his first job as an environmental engineer in Seattle. Hey, Dad. How's the North Carolina case going? It's on hold. Something else came up. Bobby told his son about Breslin's visit and the new evidence. Jesus. How many people did they poison? We're about to find out. Derek was quiet for a moment. Dad, do you ever regret it? Opening that can of worms in the first place. Bobby considered the question. 5 years ago, he'd been a bitter man who'd wanted revenge against the people who'd humiliated him. The investigation had given him that revenge and much more. Purpose, respect, financial security, and a relationship with his son that was stronger than it had ever been. But it had also cost him his marriage, his hometown, and any possibility of a quiet, anonymous life. He'd become a weapon in the war against corporate environmental crime, which meant he'd always be looking over his shoulder for the next threat, the next attempt at retaliation. No, he said finally. I don't regret it. The only thing I regret is that it took so long for the truth to come out. What are you going to do about these new sites? I'm going to burn down whatever's left of the Mills empire. And then I'm going to keep burning until there's nothing left but ashes and the truth. 3 months later, Bobby stood in a federal courtroom in Pennsylvania, watching as the last of Raymond Mills's surviving accomplices were sentenced to prison. Michael Breslin got 2 years for his cooperation and testimony. 3 other former Mills employees got longer sentences. The company that had built the elementary school over contaminated land was fined $50 million and forced into bankruptcy. Linda was in the courtroom, sitting in the back row and watching the proceedings with the careful attention of someone who'd learned to appreciate the weight of consequences. They'd spoken briefly in the hallway, cordial words between 2 people who'd shared a life but no longer share a future. I'm proud of you, she'd said simply. Thank you, Bobby had replied, and meant it. Derek was there too, having taken time off from his job to watch his father's work reach its conclusion. Afterward, they walked to Murphy's Diner for coffee and pie, a tradition that had somehow survived all the changes. So what's next? Derek asked. Bobby looked out the window at the town where he'd been born, raised his son, and discovered that ordinary people could do extraordinary things when they refused to accept the unacceptable. There's a case in Montana, he said. Mining company that's been poisoning groundwater for 30 years. The locals are starting to ask questions. Derek smiled. The Bobby Hayes Cleanup Service, traveling wherever environmental criminals fear to tread. Something like that. As they sat in the diner, where Bobby had eaten countless meals during his years as an invisible construction worker, he reflected on the strange journey that had brought him here. The gas station had been demolished years ago, replaced by a small park with a memorial plaque honoring the cancer victims. But the foundation it had provided, the evidence, the connections, the skills, the purpose, that foundation was still supporting the structure of his new life. Trevor Mills was dead. His company was gone. His political allies had been exposed and driven from office. The poison he'd spread was being slowly cleaned from the earth, one contaminated site at a time. But more importantly, the example had been set. Corporate criminals now knew that their secrets could be exposed, that their crimes would be investigated, that their victims would be avenged. Children would grow up in cleaner communities because the Mills case had shown that environmental crime carried real consequences. Bobby Hayes had built something after all, not a building or a bridge, but a legacy of accountability that would protect generations of families from the kind of predators who'd once seemed untouchable. As he and Derek left the diner and walked to their cars, Bobby felt the deep satisfaction that came from work well done. Tomorrow he would fly to Montana and start over again. New criminals to expose, new victims to help, new foundations to build on the ruins of corruption. The fool who'd bought a worthless gas station had become the man who made powerful people afraid. And in a world where the powerful often preyed on the weak, that was perhaps the most valuable construction project of all. And there you have it. Another story comes to an end. What did you think? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoy this story, consider joining our community by subscribing. It means the world to us. For more stories like this one, check out the recommended videos on screen. And I'll see you there.